All right, welcome everyone this morning to kick off the 10 stages of supply chain maturity. I am Ali Raza, the CEO and founder of Throughput. I am here with Anzar Kamdar. Today, we're excited to walk you through our methodology of fixing supply chains and not necessarily transforming them completely, but getting you back on the road, or what we call the Throughput Highway, to fulfilling more demand faster. So today, the agenda we had was just to kick off with a quick introduction of what we're doing. Naturally, these lectures are going to last about 11 to 12 weeks. The final lecture will just summarize everything that we will talk about in all the middle lectures. The goal of this today is to talk about the current frameworks that are out there, right, in terms of what's mainstream to improving supply chain throughput and what we've seen across 3,000 organizations, which would tell us otherwise, and obviously providing a solution to improving the current state wherever you are in your journey, right? So with that, maybe I'll turn it over to Anzar to think about how should we think about this entire series? Why are we doing this from your perspective?
Yeah, thanks for that, Ollie. So I think based on both of our experience, you ran multiple countries P&Ls. I started with a family construction business with 2,000 employees. I think we've both been in that situation where we've looked towards technology and these sort of different frameworks in how to scale and how to run our business better. Yet thinking back to how we were managing previously, as I mentioned with my construction business, we were managing mostly with WhatsApp, emails, and just, there were 2,000 employees, there were 12 projects happening concurrently. I thought there should be a better way as far as enabling technology to do some of the coordination and communication better. When we think of a supply chain is essentially a physical network of processes and resources to deliver a good or service. And I feel that, based on our experience and work in the last decade, running across these frameworks, I've worked at DHL, I went to MIT. The reality of what organizations are doing to fulfill demand faster, to provide that product or service, is completely disconnected from the frameworks and some of the functional, logic and tools that we're being taught. And most often than not, others would agree, regardless of what sort of technology that you buy, eventually everyone is managing their supply chain using Excel sheets or, off the cuff ideas, which is not necessarily bad, but it's not the promise of technology in enabling supply chains. I would say it has been unfulfilled. So that's why I would think we're doing this.
Yeah, on my side, I think there's just too much gatekeeping, right? Over the last 10 years, you would think these problems were already solved. And what I continuously see is that for the last 60 years, we decided that supply chain tech would be a certain way. And then every iteration of that has just been a modification of that thing that was invented 60 years ago, right? Similar to you, right? Background in engineering, ended up working across 8 countries, coincidentally around the Strait of Hormuz, and then around Yemen as well for operations. And we had digital systems. We could get any consulting firm in house that we needed. But ultimately, the big question was, what was the plan B, right? So as things, from a planning perspective, not everything goes according to plan A in operations. So I thought by now, someone would have addressed this volatility disruption stuff. So what I continuously see is, obviously there's a lot of marketing out there saying, hey, yeah, we can do this, we can fix it. Not many people live the problem, right? There's very little downstream operational impact. I know this because of all the different things and the journeys we've had at Throughput, right? So Throughput didn't just start in Silicon Valley. It spent time in Houston. It spent time in Memphis in the FedEx ecosystem. It moved to Silicon Valley when it got its first funding. We do a lot of work with government defense now as well, right? So I think we've seen the breadth of like where everybody is and what the marketing is, and there's a clear disconnect, right, in terms of what the capabilities are. And so we figured that maybe for the people who do want to fix things, right, and people who want to further their professional career, they should have access to this knowledge, right? So just cut through the noise and say this is what can be done, right? So live in a world with AI agents and other things. So I'll just pull up some slides just to showcase where the world thinks we are today, and essentially where we believe that we could be going, right? So just to kick off, like what why we're doing this, right? We continuously, and not to say we can't do this too, right? We continuously see that today in 2026, there is this hyper focus on AI agents. And not to say we don't use AI agents too, but there is this premise of, hey, if we just take Gen AI and throw it on whatever we were doing before, that's going to make things go faster. Anzur, maybe you can speak to this because you spend more time on the tech side. I'm more on the business side. Tell me about the limitations of this approach. Obviously, it's working in some cases, it's not working in other cases. In what cases does it work, and in what cases does it not work?
Well, and the slide that you bring is very packed. A lot of those processes do exist in how people manage their organizations, but as you mentioned, is just applying AI agents and some sort of automation on top of a framework that's never actually fit reality. Anyone that has real engineering experience, real systems experience, whether you're designing a power plant or designing a car, having those individual components is not where the magic lies in actually managing your organization. It's the interconnection between them. And now we're suggesting that all of a sudden, if we have AI agents doing each of those individual tasks or helping accelerate those tasks, all of a sudden, the interconnection is going to be solved, the communication between them is going to be solved, and your supply chain is going to be supercharged. And it's a framework that failed previously. It looks very pretty on a slide. It's great in theory, but there's a difference between theory and practice. And back to my analogy around a power plant, you wouldn't be necessarily like buying, each scrubber and turbine, or with a car, you wouldn't be buying the best, transmission system, the best engine. That's not how you make a car. You can get the best of each of these technologies. You can supercharge them. But if there's no coordination and there's no insight into how things connect and what the overall goal is, you're just essentially getting caught up in these local efficiencies.
Yeah, to your point, right? So why have we struggled with the coordination piece so much? I know we'll cover it probably at the last lecture and probably bring in someone who's really strong at this to explain it. But why are we still stuck in this world, right? I mean, it's been 10 years. We were experimenting with AI agents back in 2016, 2017, way before
Yeah.
anybody understood what we were doing, right? Which is, hey, like we're taking an outlier and we're turning it into English, and this is what it can do. And it seems like at least on the maintenance side, the industry is still there today, or it considers it groundbreaking. So, from your perspective, like what's gone wrong, and is this just the pathway that we have to go through, or the journey, or the next stage that we have to go through now before we realize that hey, we have to go back to the connectivity piece and making sure everything's coordinated properly?
I think there's some trade-offs and simplifications when we talk about, because what this slide screams to me is detail complexity, as in there's just so many components and you have to use AI to manage everything. But there's dynamic complexity in terms of the interactions between them. In terms of what's gone wrong, I have some theories, and when we actually get back to some of the first principles, I think when we get to the next slide, anytime you're running a business, how you're managing, how you're coordinating, even before you use digital technology, whatever form of communication you use, whatever common operating picture you create. This could be, for example, some of the listeners will be surprised to find out that some of the parts going in tier one automotives or spaceships, the suppliers for those still run on whiteboards. At the end of the shift, they manage the defects. What the advantage of that is, there's still a common decision point and a common operating picture. But the moment you start leveraging digital technology, let's say you move on to Excel, you move on to database, all of a sudden that decision point itself goes away. The information gets locked behind, but there's no common ritual or practice where people come together to a common operating picture, where information that's sometimes not quantified in databases can come together, and that common decision point is disappearing.
Yeah, and speaking of that, right? So you talked about the next slide, so we might as well proceed to that, right? So this is what we've seen, right, across at least 3,000 organizations that we've touched. And keep in mind, this has been everyone from the Panama Canal to coffee shops to U.S. Army, you name it, right? To Anzur's point, right? If most of the world is not digitized, in fact, I was just at an event a couple of days back where all the drawings for a very sophisticated piece of equipment is just by hand, right? And good luck manufacturing the spare parts for that. But this is how we see the stages of supply chain maturity, right? And what people are trying to do, and ultimately, what is the goal, answer? Like, Why are people doing all these efforts, right? And I know a lot of people and technologists talk about, hey, like we're doing this, we're doing that, but what is the true north they're trying to achieve? Whether it's an Excel sheet or they're trying to synchronize lead times from the suppliers.
Yeah, I mean, the overall goal is to make money, right? You're providing a product or a service and you're trying to make more money. You're trying to do it in the best way possible. That's the overall goal. We seem to lose sight of that objective. The slide you showed previously, the people with the responsibilities and the technology for those individual components that we saw, demand forecasting, supplier coordination, all of that, their metrics are completely different. All of a sudden, we have people optimizing those in a local silo. Those metrics become their true north, and there is no overall connection to the business goal. So the same, let's say, supplier managing their defects and getting things on time using a whiteboard, all of a sudden, let's say when we scale up, they're not necessarily concerned about getting the stuff out the door and getting the money in. It's about, I am a demand forecaster, I'm a demand planner, I'm a supply planner. These are the metrics. Forecast accuracy becomes a new true north. All of a sudden, that's what we give up as we move forward. I'm not saying that we don't need technology to scale up and accelerate, but what seems to be happening is that we forget the underlying process that has gotten us there in the first place before we jump into these technologies. And most of the time, the technology that's being pushed, that's being designed in this functional way, is not necessarily worried about the business goals. The technologies themselves are measured on local metrics like forecast accuracy. How does that make me, get me more money? It's not just the wrong framework, but it just distorts and distracts from the actual goal: how to run your business and your enterprise better.
Yeah, and I take an even more general approach to that, right? Which is the overall goal of any organization is to fulfill more demand faster at a larger scale, to your point. So, not every organization, as you know, is looking to make money. They're just trying to fulfill
Yep.
endpoint demand, right? Because they
Yep.
probably already have taxpayer money from that perspective. So, this applies not only to corporations, but also to government agencies, right? And to your point, Anzur, I think what we're trying to show people is that you're on a very deterministic path, right? We already know what the next step in the future is for you. And it's really your decision to figure out, hey, is it time we off ramp and get back to the, hey, are we really fulfilling more demand faster? Or are we turning this into some super project, right? So, what I've seen, and maybe Anzur, you can add to your experience to this, is typically what happens, and I've been there, right, is because I've gone through almost all of these stages or seen this with other providers, is you typically start out with a tally book in the field, right, where you're keeping your notes. That's good enough to track inventory. Then you realize that, hey, I can't run tally books in a whole bunch of places, so let me put it on some spreadsheets. Then someone helps you build some macros, or you build your macros yourself, and suddenly you have automation. And then right around then, you start thinking about, well, wouldn't it be so great if all of this was in one organized system that was tracked properly? And then you get to stage two for the companies that do get to stage two. And a lot of people don't realize that almost 80 to 85% of companies never get to that stage two, right? From what we've seen. And then, once you go and try to find an ERP, and I've done this, right, back in 2016, Throughput started as an IMS system, inventory management system. Then, you go in and you say, hey, well, we know obviously ERP doesn't do all the work that we want. I want an inventory management system. Then, as Anzur mentioned, you get into this whole organizational connectivity thing that we talked about initially, which a lot of the IBP initiatives go into. And then we're at where we are today, right, with the AI agents, which is, hey, what can we automate? Do the workflows work? But never do we really ask, hey, is this really making any business impact? What's been making the news more recently is ontology, right? We've seen the limitations there where, okay, the data is more flexible, but what do we really do with the data? And how can we make it predictive? So that's not really AI to begin with to start. And so you ultimately get into process mining and analytics, and you make your way to maybe a throughput when you realize there's limitations there. And then if you were ever able to get to a throughput like system, then you can do things like what I guess FiChange does, right, which is understanding the optimization limits using clean data with CFO data, and then stuff that really ties external synchronization together, which I think the people who invented this space expected this industry to get to. But here we are somewhere between stage one and two, which I like to call stage 1.5 for cleaning data. That's from your perspective. And I come from pharmaceuticals, oil and gas, chemical engineering, and then another 15 industries at Throughput. But what has this been your journey as well, or do you see it a little bit differently?
No, it's quite similar, right? On the construction side, we also have something an equivalent of tally books because we have to figure out which supplier delivered the cement, which supplier delivered all the different materials. We have to record those. It's not just for auditing and compliance reasons. It's to actually full kit. You want to make sure you have the right material to actually get started on the project. Of course, it will eventually end up in an Excel, but that's what you do, right? You're essentially a field engineer. You're making sure everything's on site so you can get the project done. What's funny about this is that all of a sudden, if you start leveraging technology, this manual recording that you do, so, from my time with warehouses, even if you digitize some of these aspects, you could do it with a barcode scanner or something like that, you still end up actually needing to verify the data. You need to reconcile the digital and physical worlds. You need to do inventory counts. It's funny because you're essentially doing the same thing. Now you just have the added step of entering it into a technology system that's taking more time. It's not necessarily helping you move faster. Of course, it can provide visibility, it can help with scale, and there is merit to that, but there is a lack of business impact. You're just eating up more time from your resources this way.
Yeah, to your point, right? We work with organizations where, again, they've gone through this, and they can get any system that they want. But ultimately, what we discovered for them was that if 40% of the data is wrong from the endpoint, going back to supply chain and procurement, then you're basically ordering against 40% false positives, right? And if you look at it from that perspective, I mean, these guys are ordering billions of dollars of stuff that is never going to see the actual need fulfilled for what it is intended for, because that need does not exist, right? So ultimately, you can have all the systems that you want, but if you don't have discipline at the endpoint, cleaning up the outliers, seeing what the issues are, and being really strong from an operational process perspective, especially if you work in like maintenance and production, and say on the POS side, it's a little bit cleaner because you're scanning stuff in, and like at a dollar store, for example. But the a good way to put it is the balloon deflates really quickly, right? When someone really just raises their hand and says, "Hey, let's see what's really going through the system in terms of data," and they find out that it's just dirty, and it's just dirty data getting to the endpoint faster between both locations, and it's not being cleaned up. It just really doesn't solve the problem, right? So we understand from a tracking perspective, these systems have to be put in place. But if you're not really dealing with clean data, where do you even start, right? And I think that brings us to the next slide. And just the way we are framing this, Anzer, is obviously everybody knows the problems, right? But
Yep.
nobody really gets to the solutions. This has been sort of my beef with a lot of the analyst firms, right? Saying, hey, okay, we know the problem, right? But how are is there a pathway to get off from this sort of like unilateral pathway itself, right? Road, so you don't go through these like 9, 8, 9, 10 stages and then realize that, hey, I really just needed clean data to begin with. How do I how do I impact the business?
Yeah, I mean, funny that you bring that up, right? Once you get in any of these stages, it's a long journey down the rabbit hole, right? Ali brings up information uncertainty. If you're an engineer on the field, you're always going to have information uncertainty based on the environment, but you're able to make judgment calls. All of a sudden, when you start, pushing these responsibilities to very brittle systems, of course, there's some exceptions that can work with that. Uh, all of a sudden, you're getting caught up in these large exercises around cleaning data, cleaning the master data. Uh, Trusting and validating the system, outputs and inputs and decisions. It ends up being like a multi-year journey. There's a way to shortcut most of this. As Ali mentioned, what we show right now on the screen is actually what we've seen in actual organizations. Aside from all the fancy frameworks and beautiful digital brain diagrams and things that we see, this is the reality of how we map the organizations that we speak to and work with, because they're almost always at this stage. At the same time, we've helped them accelerate out of these rabbit holes, and we're going to be sharing some of our experiences around that.
Yeah, and to Andrew's point, right? We have met companies from stage 1 to 7, right? So we have experience just getting them to throughput, and it's even more difficult getting them beyond throughput, right? So this is not just a advertisement for throughput, right? This is like, hey, there's even more promise beyond what we can do. But you have to get off the stage that you're in today and get back on the right road. And I think that's how we're trying to change the perspective of how to get back onto what we call the throughput highway, right? Which is ultimately, however you define the goal, and these are just the stages shrunk down on signs. The goal is you need to get back to a highway where you're fulfilling more demand faster, right? There's two ways of looking at this, right? Some of us look at it from, hey, we're on a highway to a final destination and we sort of took a detour and now we're sort of stuck. I like to look at it at a different way, right? Which the image that I would prefer would be like, hey, like you are stuck in one of these side roads, right? And you're trying to get back to that highway to throughput. And so, what we are going to do over the next 11 to 12 lectures is just to walk you through that no matter where you are. And we already have the first stage published that you can go find on the throughput website or on LinkedIn. What can be done, right? So next week we'll talk about how to do more with spreadsheets, or maybe move away from spreadsheets to something like stage 10, which you can easily do if you're willing to skip all of these different roads, right? So Anjar, speak to me about this. What do you look at it the same way? Are you more of an on-ramp guy or an off-ramp guy? Clearly, like, off-ramp is the way to go because a lot of these guys are stuck, but in a way they really need to on-ramp onto the throughput highway again to get to their final destination, which I still think is fulfilling more demand faster, right? Even if it's not making money.
I mean, it depends on the day, but right now I'm an off ramp guy. Don't want to get stuck, but the how to is the on ramp in terms of how to actually get back to the main goal. Um, yeah, I mean, the entire idea here is to refocus and prioritize your resources in a way in service to your ultimate objective and your ultimate goal. And for most businesses, that could be money or it could be fulfilling demand faster for other organizations.
Copy. And with that, this is what we're going to do for the next, I'd say 11 Fridays, right? Just get on 30 minutes, look at some of your questions, Q&A. If we don't get to it during the lecture, we'll just, respond to you separately. But the entire goal here is not to belittle anyone or say, hey, there's a technology that doesn't work. But if you truly are stuck, right, but you have invested in a solution, and it's not getting the business impact. And more importantly, if the boards and the CEOs are questioning it, and that's a lot of where we operate now, right? Which is, hey, just last week, some private equity group reached out and said, hey, I acquired this business. They're in the recycling, and can you come out and just figure out how I can get more business impact, right? If those are the conversations you're looking to have, and furthermore, if you're really looking to accelerate your career so you don't have to spend the next 10 years doing what we had to do, right, which is learn the hard way by pilots and in enterprise production and all sorts of other things that we had to do to get here and see what was really out there. This is really for you, right? What we get out of this is knowledge that if you guys can absorb faster, maybe we can actually get you to the at least stage 8 faster, which is our stage. But for those of you who really pick up on this stuff, maybe we get you to stage 9 and 10 faster, where some of the people that attend our supply chain town halls on Friday show up, right? So the way I look at this is there is a different way of doing supply chain throughput. We are providing an alternative pathway. If you want to stay on your IBP and WMS and ERP journey, by all means you can. We've been there, we've done it, we've used it, we've worked with CFOs, CEOs, we've shown them where the gaps are. We're trying to just deliver this completely, essentially free of charge, right? If you want to go on our website, try out Eli version 2.0, that's also free. We're at that stage of the company where we're really looking to mature the industry to get to a certain point so we can do more impactful stuff. And that, I'll hand it back to Anzer for any final thoughts, and then we'll sign off.
Yeah, from my perspective, as Ali mentioned, we're trying to give our perspective and our learnings over the last decade. As I mentioned, if I was about to start a business right now, I have a good lay of the land as far as which technologies I would use and I would not. Because ultimately, what's being pitched right now is some of my colleagues ask me, how can you actually run a supply chain? How can you run a business without an ERP? And that's funny to me because if we're thinking of logistics, before digital technologies, people were managing massive amounts of resources and manpower to accomplish goals. So we seem to be stuck in this digital age where our physical capabilities are falling behind in terms of our ability to manage resources, mobilize resources. And we seem to have become dependent on technology and information, which, while the promises were clear visibility and information and better decisions, we seem to be going the other way. So, yeah, for anyone that's getting into this career as far as supply chain or just looking to start their own business, that requires effective utilization and management of resources, yeah, stay tuned. We're gonna give a lot of our tips and experiences away.
Yeah, and we'll expose all the constraints of running supply chains, right? Which is
Yeah,
more important than, like Anzur, as you mentioned, when you come into the industry, it's all like, everything is a promised land. But when you really understand what these systems do and what they're used for, it's far more effective and a faster way to get to where you're getting to, right? So with that, we'll conclude the first session. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll publish stage one on Monday and kick off the next lecture around same time on Friday. Thanks, everyone.
all right. Thank you, everyone.